Hello YouTube. This video is about keeping this transmission cool. This transmission is a beefed up Turbo 400. It has a reverse valve body in it and it has a pro brake in it. The pro brake is a device that shifts the transmission into reverse and first at the same time so the car can't move so you can have a good launch. As you can suspect, that does a lot to heat the fluid of the transmission up. But it's only momentary, and what a lot of racers do is they run a loop of tubing and use that as their cooling. We're going to do a little bit more than that. This is different from what you would do going down the road. Going down the road, the transmission is under constant load. You need constant air across it or in the radiator. This only has a load on it for a very momentary period of time, and then you shut the thing off after your run. We had intended to run hard lines out of the coolant ports on a transmission, up along the block, behind the exhaust, forward to the radiator, and in front of the radiator, and put it between the front radiator and the grill. But there just isn't room. We're not going to do that. What we are going to do is come out of those two ports, travel backwards across the top of this member and through this member and put a cooler right here. Something like this. As this is the chosen location for many reasons, we want to support the cooler in between the vehicle frame. And what we're going to do is build a small frame for the cooler. And we'll build it in such a way that it only takes 2 bolts or nuts, we haven't decided which, to bolt the cooler in place. The way we'll do that is to build a small frame for the cooler, and on this edge there'll be 2 bolts holding it to the frame. And on this edge, there'll be pins that go into the vehicle frame. That way, this unit can be brought in and stuck into those 2 pinholes and bolted with 2 bolts, and the cooler can be taken out and maintained in an easy manner. I spent some time doodling on paper, and I think we've come up with a plan. We're going to build this frame, this is the frame, out of 3/4 inch square tubing. So this represents how the tubing would be laid out. We'd have 2 pieces inside of 2 longer pieces. This piece would be right up against the frame. This represents the pin that we'd put on the end of the square tubing so it could insert into the frame of the vehicle. And what this represents is a grommet that's inserted into the frame that the pin goes through. So I've come up with measurements of 9 inches and 13 and 5/8 inches for the long ones. So here we go on our first cut. And that's the last cut for our frame. Let's square up the end. And round the sharp edges off. Here's what our frame looks like. That looks pretty square. The reason this is indented is because there's a body bracket right there. So we can't put this all the way to the edge. And here's our pin for the end. We'll weld that on the end, and that'll be the pin that goes in the frame. And here's the grommet that'll be in the frame. So this pin will slide into the grommet that's in the frame, and it'll be on the end of our frame. Next, we're going to make the pins that go on the end of our frame. And this is just a stud, and I'm going to cut all the threads off so we end up with just a short piece here, and that will be the pin on the end. I'll bet that's hot. This is pretty much how it's going to look. It's all square. It's ready to be sandblasted to get rid of the scale and welded. Here's our frame and here's our pins. Let's go get it sandblasted. And here we go. We have the frame for the cooler all cleaned up, clamped up, squared up, ready for welding. That includes the pins that are going to go into the frame. This is upside down right now, but this will go on there like that. There's room here, a gap there. And there'll be studs that come up like this with nuts that screw down on it. So if you wanted to, you could remove the cooler from the car without taking the frame down, but it's going to be easier to remove the whole thing as one piece. This side of the support of the frame from the car is taken care of by these pins, but we have to support this side. So my thought is to take another piece of 3/4 inch tubing and weld it to the frame and then run a stud and a bolt to hold the frame in place. So let's cut this piece. Here we have our frame, and we're going to tack it into position so that we can test fit it. We have our vehicle frame leveled out in both directions. So that gives us a good starting point to mount our transmission cooler. With the frame of the transmission cooler set at 0 and the vehicle set at 0, we can start thinking about marking the holes for the pins. What I've set up here is a laser going right through the ends of the pins, and if we remove the transmission cooler, the laser will paint the inside of the vehicle frame. What we have now is a level line around the inside of the frame at the height that we want the pins for the transmission cooler to be. We can start thinking about drilling some holes. I've laid out where we need the holes for the pins for the frame for the transmission cooler. The next step is to center punch and start drilling some holes. Here we go. We're going to be committed. We'll start with an 1/8 inch pilot hole. We've got one grommet in place and it fits nicely. We need a 7/8 inch hole for the grommet. Now I'm going to use a step drill to get up close to that, but I don't want to finish it with a step drill because it'll leave a ridge on the back side. We'll drill the last 2 steps with regular drills. So here we go. I don't know if you can see it, but you see the lip on the inside? So now we're going to use an 11/16 inch drill to get rid of that lip. Now, so we have no lip, and then we'll go to 7/8. So now we'll go to 7/8. And we're through. Now we'll take a file and knock that back edge off. And let's see if we can put a grommet in there. It's time to see if we've done it right. And let's insert the pins into the grommets and swing the frame up to the inside submember, and it works out and it's nice clearance. We have test fitted the frame in the car and it fits. We have the transmission cooler on top of the frame. What we need to do is find a way to fasten the transmission cooler to the frame. We have carefully marked the holes on the transmission cooler onto our frame. Then we have drawn a center line through the hole, and we're ready to locate the bolts. Now what are we going to do for bolts? Well, here's a normal bolt with a head on it, and if we went all the way through, we'd have a head sticking out the back side. So what we're going to do is drill a hole all the way through, cut the head off of the bolt, and stick it in the hole and weld it. And that way we'll have a stud sticking through. So let's center punch these holes for the drill. And off to the drill press we go. We'll start with our favorite 1/8 inch drill. These are 1/4 inch bolts, so we'll drill a 1/4 inch hole. And our 1/4 inch bolt should fit, and it does. Let's cut some heads off of bolts. Here's our frame with the 4 studs in place, and we've changed our minds. We're going to put this on the top rather than the bottom. So this fits down over the studs like so, and then we'll just put nuts on. So all we got to do is weld it up. It's time to start thinking about where the hoses are going to go. We have to go through this bulkhead. So how do we find the position for the hose? Well, the distance from the fitting to the center of our frame is exactly 1 inch. This level line goes through the middle of our frame. So I've measured up 1 inch from our level line and drawn a line all the way across. Now I can take this drill and extend it out and mark the location where that hole wants to be. This is the start of the holes for the hoses for the transmission cooler, and we start it the same way. We'll start with our favorite 1/8 inch drill bit. We have the pilot holes drilled for the transmission coolant lines. We don't want to just run the transmission line through the frame. We'd like to sleeve the hole, and we need the sleeve to be big enough for the AN line and the AN fitting. The outside dimension of this tube is 1 1/4 inches, so we need to drill a 1 1/4 inch hole in these 2 places. To that end, I have a 1 1/4 inch hole saw here that I'm going to try to use to make these holes with. Here we go. And we're through. Let's see if it fits. Very nice. What we've done to fill the ends of the tube is to cut little pieces of metal that fit into the tube, and we'll weld it up, and when it's done, it should look like that. What we're doing here is welding the sleeves in for the transmission cooler lines. We have everything tacked up. Let's try a trial fit. And it stays in by itself. And the next step is lines. What we have here are all the components necessary to make up the lines for the cooler. We have an adapter that screws into the cooler. This is a 1/2 inch pipe thread that's reduced down to a 6 AN fitting. We have a 6 AN fitting for the hose that screws onto that. A hose that'll have to be cut and fastened to that fastener. Another hose end for the transmission, and an adapter for the transmission that also goes to 6 AN. First thing we'll do is screw in the adapters into the cooler. Now this is a pipe thread, so we want to put sealant on the pipe thread. And clean off any that's on the end. And screw it in. Let's take out the stock coolant line fittings. And underneath that is a copper washer, which you want to make sure you remove. This is our banjo adapter fitting to go to 6 AN. And we'll take and put a little anti-seize on the threads. No sealant required here because the fitting is sealed by a compression ring. So make sure you put the compression rings in. And I'm not going to tighten these down because I don't know where I'm going to point them yet. We have both adapters screwed into the transmission, but I haven't tightened them all the way down so that I can point the 6AN connectors in the direction I want when we run the lines. I've put ends on some of the lines and it's laying out pretty good. We need to put an end on this line right here, so let's go do that. The way I mark the hose where it needs to be cut is I disassemble the connector and screw the connector onto our cooler and put the hose where I want it. And right there at the end of the connector is where we're going to cut the hose, and we'll mark that with a piece of tape. Carefully clamp the hose in the vise. Cut it with a cut-off wheel. A hacksaw will not work. We have to cut it very gently so we don't spray the steel of this braid. You want a nice square cut. Carefully remove the tape from the end of the hose. Now I think this is the toughest part. You got to take this hose end and you got to put it over the end of this braided hose, and it doesn't want to go. This is a struggle. So I start with the fitting tilted like that, getting as much of the bottom part of the hose in the hole as I can. And then I take a little screwdriver and I ease myself around, pushing that braid into the coupler. And this takes a little time. And once you've got everything into the coupler, you just push it on. And that's not an easy thing to do. A twisting motion sometimes helps you get this end on, but it is a struggle. What we're attempting to do is push that hose all the way to the end of the coupler. And when you've got it all the way to the end of the coupler, it's in far enough. So we have the hose all the way to the end of the coupler. There's a little ridge there that you can identify it. But if you look closely, the hose is full of rubber from when we did the cutoff. So we're going to have to blow it out. We don't want junk in our Now what we want to do is spread the hose out against the coupler. So I take this thing, put a little oil on it, and push it down inside the hose, and it'll push the hose up against the side of the coupler. Take my fitting, put a drop of oil on the bottom of that where it's going to connect the hose. Take some anti-seize and put it on the aluminum threads. And thread it in. These are not name brand couplers. And although my 6AN wrench fits the hose connecting, it does not fit the nut that we need to tighten. You should use AN wrenches because you'll scratch up the fitting. This fitting is a no name fitting. I may replace them all because they should fit. So I'm going to use a 3/4 inch wrench. And be careful and screw this in. Now when I'm screwing this in, I'm watching very carefully that I'm not pushing the hose out of the fitting. And I like to screw these things in until I got a thumbnail's worth of thickness between the coupler nut and the hose fitting, and then I square up the ends so the flats are the same and it looks professional. And this is what we end up with. Let's go put it on the car. We'll feed it through our sleeve hole and up and onto the transmission and down to the cooler. And I believe we ended up with what we wanted. Here we are on the last welding job on this project. We're welding in the bolts that'll hold up the cooler. With our anchor bolts welded in and the lines routed to the transmission, Let's see if we can put the cooler in place while it's bolted to the frame. And it clicks up into place. We can take a nut and a washer and put it on the bolt that's coming through the cooler frame. This is what it looks like underneath and bolted in. A final look at the system. If you enjoyed this video, there'll be more.